Tonight, we won't march through battlefields or rattle sabers under a flag. Instead, we'll step into a quieter part of the war, a row of canvas tents where the night presses close but never quite intrudes. The air smells faintly of paper, lamp oil, and the iron tang of water cooling in tin mugs. A single bulb swings overhead, its light flickering across a table stacked with forms waiting for names, for decisions, for the slow weight of handwriting. Here, the war has ended on paper, but not in certainty. Its sentences trail off in half-finished signatures, in orders that pause instead of stop. Outside, the desk folds itself into the fields, with the quiet efficiency of a clerk stacking documents, and the wind tugs at the canvas walls like someone asking to come in. Across these tables, men trace their fates in pencil marks small enough to fit under a thumbprint, yet heavy enough to divide lives into return and remain. Papers travel faster than soldiers. Their carbon copies whisper through the night like messenger birds who never tire. Inside the tent, the air holds its breath between the clink of enamel cups and the shuffle of boots, as if history itself is waiting for the next name to be written. So lower the lights. Let the weight of this unfinished story rest against your shoulders as lightly as the night air outside the canvas. And if this quiet keeps you company for a while, stay as long as you like. The story will keep unfolding, whether your eyes stay open or drift closed before the last page turns. And beyond the last flicker of the lamp, the tense weight rows of canvas walls breathing in the night air, holding inside them the soft murmur of pens, boots, and voices just above a whisper. Somewhere among them lies the first signature, the first question, the first story that will turn the war from noise into paper. That is where we'll go next quietly, the way these things always begin. The story of not going home during the Korean War begins at a table, under canvas, where the breeze lifts the tent wall like a page being turned by someone in no hurry. Names, places, and pencil marks as simple things were used to measure one of the strangest choices a soldier could face. The armistice carried a signature, but not a full stop, as if the war itself ended with an unfinished sentence drifting across rice paddies and railway lines. Papers traveled faster than people, which is typical of papers. Lists left the field ahead of the bodies they named, arriving at headquarters with the crispness of new stationery and the weight of decisions that would take longer to catch up. The armistice did not actually resolve the matter of home. It simply moved the conversation to a set of neutral tents at Panmunjom, where neutrality was practiced like a polite sport. Imagine long tables under light bulbs that made a faint fizzing sound, chairs that scraped louder than any voice, and a narrow aisle down the center where officers strode as if hurrying through a grocery store after closing time. Between the tents stood small flags, each weighted by little bags of sand, so they would not collapse during the frequent shy gusts of wind, which seemed to prefer the company of paper to that of persons. The rule was that decisions would be made in one direction only. You entered facing north or south, and you were encouraged to continue facing that way, like a human arrow. Translators stood behind the chairs and looked patiently at everyone's noses, because noses reveal when someone has finished speaking, and that is a useful fact in an environment where sentences cross borders before the person does. Nearby, in envelopes that had been opened and resealed so many times the glue grew weary, were letters from home, often photographed strangely so that wives and mothers appeared to be standing on tiptoe in their own kitchens, as if stretching to reach the reader. The atmosphere was not quite tense. It was the sort of quiet a museum keeps, a hush that assumes everyone will behave because the floor is polished. If you listened long enough, you could hear coffee cups settling on saucers like small decisions practicing their landings. Inside these tents, the choice was rehearsed again and again. Would a prisoner of war agree to repatriation, or choose to remain with captors and cross into a new life under a new flag? The question was asked in 3 parts, as if asking it only once might startle it, and each part was written in 4 languages to be absolutely sure it remained on the page. Everyone was careful with verbs. Verbs are slippery and have been known to defect. The questions were simple, but the room was not. Because the war had taught people to count everything: bullets, blankets, calories, kilometers. The counting instinct persisted into the piece. Scribes tallied signatures with a thoroughness usually reserved for seat catalogs. 1 signature was sufficient. More signatures were only more of the same, like extra blankets in July. The pens were on strings, both to prevent loss and to remind everyone that choices, too, are tethered. Outside, photographers set up little stools and asked each man to sit for a portrait either before or after the decision. Whichever time the light was better. That last clause is important. History, unlike the sun, often prefers the late afternoon. The photographs show an odd serenity. The faces seem to say, "I am here to decide about my life, but first I will sit very still and let the lens finish its coffee." Beyond the wire, voices arrived with the persistence of morning announcements. Loudspeaker trucks wandered up and down the edges of neutrality, like dogs walking an invisible fence. From each speaker came a choice of words as carefully tailored as a new coat. Some offered encouragement to return. Others offered encouragement to remain. Several advertised the pleasant climate of the future. The music between announcements was the sort of marching tune that makes it difficult to march, because one foot wants to move forward while the other politely declines. Clergy appeared in different robes to speak with the captured. Humorless, practical doctors recorded temperatures and sometimes opinions. It was all quite organized, in the way a rainstorm is organized, every drop going somewhere, but not exactly under anyone's control. Meanwhile, inside the tents, entirely separate rituals unfolded. A folded flag lay on a table to give the room a posture. The chairs were arranged in right angles because angles suggested ideals. On the clipboard, each name looked like a sealed door. The guard by the flap of the tent lifted it at regular intervals to let a little air out of the past and a little air into the future. The motives for not going home were numerous and behaved like socks in a drawer. None exactly matched, but all performed the same function. Some men feared punishment at home and hoped to reset the clock by staying. Others believed a new ideology would fit better than the old one. The ideological salesmen were nothing if not attentive, with pamphlets as glossy as apples and just as likely to bruise. Many men were simply tired, and in fatiguing circumstances, even a complicated alternative can feel like rest. Still others discovered that after years of captivity, they had learned their captors. Jokes, and once you laugh at the same jokes, a sort of bland fellowship, appears one not especially strong, but comfortable like the back row of a bus. The public called some of this brainwashing, a term that sounded dramatic enough to sell newspapers and gentle enough to let readers finish their toast. Yet the record shows more stubbornness than sorcery. People held on to opinions they already owned, the way pockets hold on to lint. The interviewers, who were trained to keep their faces as neutral as the tents, wrote long notes on brief conversations, and the notes had the patient tone of a gardener describing rain. It came, it went, some of it sank in. As the weeks stretched like the taut ropes of the tents, reasons for staying or returning took on ritual shapes. Men who had grown up on farms imagined working in fields again, and made little hand gestures as if smoothing the heads of wheat. Men who had grown up in cities narrated street corners to themselves, describing exactly where the best noodle shop had stood before a certain winter, then considering whether it would still stand when they arrived. Some worried about marriage proposals concerning them in absentia. A few had received letters that contained unhelpfully cheerful phrases like, "You will not recognize the neighborhood," which was accurate but not motivational. Some were afraid of being praised for bravery they had not performed, which is a surprisingly heavy burden, the kind that makes a person choose the longest possible march just to avoid the parade. Others had changed religions or acquired one and were reluctant to relocate the new altar. It is worth noting that many decisions were, in the end, practical. A man might simply prefer the rice on one side to the barley on the other. Someone always has a favorite grain. The odd humor of this is that enormous speeches were drafted to address what were, at times, very culinary convictions. The paths of those who refused repatriation were carefully drawn on maps that did not yet contain the places they would live. It took cartographers a little time to catch up, which is understandable. Maps like Rules and Rules were very busy that year. Those who returned home were processed by new units with old names, and the paperwork creaked with the effort of having to describe, in precise language, reasons that had been whispered. Meanwhile, those who stayed were escorted to fresh quarters, and in an oddly domestic touch, asked to choose between two types of bedding, neither of which the records bother to describe. We can only assume one was firmer. Interviews traveled with them like suitcases, filled with clauses about freedom of choice and not otherwise. On both sides of the line, the same phrases were spoken with opposite meanings. Everyone sounded confident in the way a person sounds when reading a recipe aloud. Years later, historians would compare these statements and find that certain adjectives appeared so often they lost their flavor. This is common in cooking and in politics. In the archive, the documents of choice live quietly. The room is climate controlled, which means it has the same weather every day, an enviable arrangement. Boxes sit on shelves with numbers on their spines like polite marching orders. Within the boxes are files, and within the files are forms, and within the forms are questions that could be answered with a pencil. There are tally sheets with columns whose labels are a lesson in neutrality. Option A, Option B, Option C. The handwriting slants differently depending on which side of the tent the writer once preferred. Paper has an impressive memory for small things. It remembers that one interpreter liked to underline every third noun. It remembers that one officer's signature grew larger as the day wore on, as if stretching its legs. Here and there, a form contains an erasure so careful it looks like a thought taking off its shoes. When researchers request these files, the staff produces them with the calm efficiency of a well-practiced magician, removing scarves from a sleeve. A white-gloved hand slides the folder onto the table, and there it sits, humming at a frequency only the patient can hear. The files also contain letters written for the record and letters written for the heart, although the archive does not label them that way. Some are typed, which means they sound like rain when you turn them over. Some are written in pencil on thin stationery, and they look like a shy conversation between one person and a winter evening. A few contain pressed flowers, shredded stacks of petals deteriorating quietly, which the conservator dutifully notes as organic inclusions. It is difficult to write a convincing policy memo about organic inclusions, although people have tried. The most arresting items are the witness statements in which both sides claim the same man for their story, like a pair of biographies that share a protagonist. The language is always polite. It is so polite that you can hear the metal folding chair straighten its back as you read. When the archive closes for the night, the lights dim in 2 stages. This is done for energy efficiency, but it also feels like a bow. If, at the end of a long day of reading, you asked what not going home was truly like, the papers would suggest that it was a great deal like standing at a small table and signing your name beside a line that repeated a question you had already answered in your mind. It was like stepping from shade to sun, not because the temperature changed very much, but because your eyes did. The procedures were thorough. Medical examinations occurred with all the enthusiasm of routine. Chaplain spoke in gentle geometry, outlining options as if they were diagrams for assembling a bookshelf. Translators repeated your words back to you with the careful pronunciation of a person learning a song. There were stamps that thumped like soft hammers, and dates that arranged themselves neatly as if an invisible ruler guided each number into place. At the moment of decision, time became attentive. It did not slow down exactly. It merely made more space between seconds, as if generously allowing thoughts to walk abreast rather than single file. At home later, the phrase brainwashing would linger in newspapers, and in conversations over kitchen tables, it would be spoken with the same tone reserved for a neighbor as unusual garden ornament curiosity tinged with mild disapproval. People preferred the explanation that involved mysterious machines and hypnotic broadcasts because such explanations are restful. If there is a machine, then the story is only about the machine. Meanwhile, the men who stayed or returned lived out their choices in ways that do not fit in headlines. A few sent letters to their old units, thanking a medic by name for a small kindness, and the letter vanished into a folder labeled miscellaneous. Some, on either side, opened shops and sold ordinary things like bicycle bells and enamel basins. One can listen to the recorded oral histories and hear pride in the faintest increments. Pride in how a signature looked that day. Pride in not trembling. Pride in asking for a second copy for mother. The transcript notes every subject's pauses with a bracketed ellipsis, as if the pause itself were a document needing preservation. The need to categorize motives never went away because people love shelves. Scholars have separated fear from conviction and conviction from fatigue, as if each came in a different size of jar. Yet in the testimonies, the categories are not so obedient. Belief and fear travel together like cousins who share a suitcase. Hope borrows slippers from convenience and returns them scuffed. One man spoke of a chessboard he had carved from bread and the feeling of strategy sitting on his tongue. That feeling, he said, told him he was already living in a different country, even if geography had not received notice. Another remembered a teacher from before the war who had told him to finish what you start, and while that advice did not explicitly mention political ideology, it proved surprisingly adaptable. Meanwhile, the loudspeakers along the wire spoke in sentences that leaned heavily on adverbs, and as everyone knows, adverbs are the first to go when history is edited for clarity. In the last minutes of the day, the archive settles on its shelves like a sleeping flock of paper birds. Outside, the corridor smells faintly of floor polish and old cardboard, which is the scent of history agreeing to be quiet for a while. A reader perhaps who closes a folder and looks at the clock and considers the walk home. It is impossible not to think about the men in the tents, weighing a similar walk, only theirs crossed a border drawn to be straight and learned to be crooked. The idea of home is uncooperative. It changes shape when measured. For some, home was the place with a shorter winter and a familiar soup. For others, home was the place where their new friends would understand the joke about the officer and the missing can opener. For a few, home was the line on the paper where the pen touched and made a small bruise and did not lift until the name was complete. A gentle irony of the episode is that the tents where non-returners chose not to return were themselves temporary, rolled up at last and carried away, leaving only patches of ground that could have been anywhere. If I asked you a bedside question now, if you were in that tent, which box would you touch? We would discover that our answer changes slightly each time we imagine it, like the way a pillow becomes a new shape each time you turn it over. There is no perfect certainty in a canvas room. The bulbs hum, the translators murmur, the officer clears his throat, the pen hangs from its string, and bumps the metal tin of paper clips with a friendly clink. The line waits for the name. A breath enters, then leaves, then enters again. Outside the flap, the road goes north and south at the same unhurried speed. Somewhere, a kettle boils, and someone forgets to lift it for a full minute because they are reading a note that says, "Remember to bring the ledger." Somewhere else, a guard counts buttons because buttons are a comfort when the rest of the world is abstract. The act of choosing in the end was a very small movement of the hand, and a long, slow settling of the heart hardly visible, easily filed, gently tedious to describe, and thus just right for bedtime. So we let the canvas fall back into place. We allow the pencils to dull without panic. We picture the neutral tense breathing steadily through another night, the flags outside making short bows to a wind that forgets its lines. The lists are folded. The ink grows a little tired and decides to stay where it is. The word home lies down beside the word choice, and they manage, after some shuffling, to share the same pillow. Somewhere years later, an archivist will label a box, and the label will align perfectly with the edge. It will be a small, satisfying thing, and the box will make that soft cardboard sound that means it is comfortable. The light will click off once, then again, and the hallway will keep its promise to echo only a little. If you're still awake, that is fine. We can keep reading names for a while longer, but if your eyes are drifting, let them. The tent is warm, the chair is simple, and the pen waits patiently for the next unhurried signature, the next gentle, ordinary moment of not going home. You might not expect a rectangle to be so opinionated, but the world's most popular sheet of paper has a very firm idea about itself. It prefers neat halves and enjoys millimeters. It is pleased, though never excitable, to be exactly 210 by 297, if anyone asks. There are more dramatic inventions, of course, but few that slide so calmly into a printer tray and declare geometry complete. Tonight we will tuck ourselves into the soft folds of paper standards, how a quiet family of sizes drifted out of mathematics, adopted middle management, and eventually became the default background for nearly every mild surprise in office life. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe with the gentle conviction of a rubber stamp. But please, don't overexert yourself. We are discussing rectangles that nap by design. The story opens long before photocopiers began coughing politely. In the 18th century, a German physicist named Georg Christoph Lichtenberg looked at ordinary sheets and saw the fidgety chaos of ratios that refused to be friends. He proposed a cousinlier rectangle, one that, when folded in half along its short side, would reproduce the same proportion as before. This is the sly trick of the square root of 2, a number that does not round up, does not round down, and never throws a tantrum. The French Revolution also took a turn at tiding paper because when you have already reorganized the calendar, it feels unthreatening to measure stationery by the meter. They considered splendid names and not a few ideals, but paper at that time remained a local habit. Every town had a favorite size that carried its smell's personality, like the scent of linen drying indoors. Scribes trimmed edges with pocket knives and considered themselves artists in the medium of margins. In monasteries, the parchment ancestors looked on indulgently, because parchment always looks on indulgently. It knows patience in a way modern paper can only copy. The rectangle waited politely through the 19th century, while steam presses learned to breathe. In 1922, Germany made a decision with the unassuming title DIN 476, establishing the A series, a O with an area of 1 square meter, A1 a neat half, A2 another half again, and so on until a 10, a size with the confidence of a slightly larger postage stamp. DIN standards are the sort of thing you might imagine wearing a tidy hat. They specify not only the numbers, but the rounding, the tolerance, and with exquisite calm, the corners. A 4 to 210 by 297 millimeters would not become a household celebrity immediately. Fame is a marathon with water stations consisting primarily of staplers. Yet this proportion had already perfected its bedtime routine. When an F4 is folded, it becomes an F5 that looks back at you with the same serene face, as if nothing of consequence has happened. Printers and binders love this because it means machines can have and have again without having to rethink their feelings about angles. The elegant mathematics has an almost nursery rhyme logic. AO is 1 square meter, which feels pleasingly grown up. Fold it once, a 1. Fold again, a 2. The ratio of sides remains the same because the square root of 2 is, in practice, a lullaby. If a drawing lives on a 3 and must visit in a 4 folder, it can simply bend at the waist and the world stays proportional. This is the sort of practicality that makes office life bearable on a Tuesday. Photocopiers purr because enlargement from a 4 to a 3 is a tidy 141%, a number so useful that many machines memorialize it with its own button. The default margins, 12 or 20 millimeters, came not from an edict but from thousands of trays that preferred not to smudge their cuffs. Hole punches established a quiet republic, 80 millimeters between the 2 holes, like a pair of eyes gazing at the horizon of a lever arch file. You can fall asleep just counting the notches. Adoption spread in a drift rather than a march. European ministries standardized forms with the relief of people who had spent decades writing over the tops of logos. Manufacturers began selling reams with a faint perfume of new opportunity, which is to say starch. Schools discovered that whether the exercise was geography or poetry, it looked slightly more accomplished when breathing on a 4. The narrower width invited a tidy paragraph. The longer height rewarded a well-behaved conclusion. Japan introduced JIS, which mirrored the A series with local elegance, so that subway notices and delicate stationery could agree about the structure of enlightenment, even art adapted. Sketchbooks offered a 3 to make elbow room polite, and printers enjoyed the well-behaved imposition of pages, 4, 8, 16 nesting like dozing birds. Somewhere a bureaucrat finally aligned 3 columns inside a form and felt a happiness so measured you could have surveyed it with a ruler. This is not to say paper standards eradicated variety. They merely taught it to queue. Envelopes developed personalities entirely disproportionate to their responsibilities. The DL envelope, a third of an A4, became the preferred vehicle for invoices that sounded sorry for nothing. C4 permitted the sheet to lie flat without crease, a luxury reserved for certificates and the occasional stern letter about compliance. B-series sizes were invented to tidy the gap between S, which is the kind of considerate thought you only get from people who label the hinges on equipment racks. Printers developed opinions about grain direction, which is to say the way the fibers in paper prefer to nap. Feeding the sheet against the grain makes it curl like a cat with an opinion about where sunlight should be. Fold a leaflet the long way, and you have a gatefold that opens with the self-importance of a small palace. Fold it the short way, and it becomes a booklet that behaves decently in a coat pocket. These are not thrilling discoveries, of course, but they are the friendly luggage of daily life. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States and Canada leaned into their own favorite rectangles. 8.5 by 11 inches, a size with the mysterious certainty of a grandfather clock that has never actually met a clockmaker. The origins are contested. Some say it emerged from the reach of papermakers' arms. Others prefer the theory of an early 20th century committee that settled on the number the way one settles on a comfortable shoe. Legal size stretched ambitiously to 14 inches, perhaps because laws, like trousers, occasionally need hemming. There were attempts at simplification in Washington that would have converted the nation to the metric fold, but letters continued on letter size because drawers and habits had been sculpted around them, and drawers and habits are sturdy carpenters. The divergence resulted in a gentle comedy of adapters. Hole punches with 3 rings instead of 2 binders that widen like a person inhaling to appear taller. Photocopiers that squint at an A4 and ask whether you meant to leave that sliver of resignation at the bottom. If you have ever printed a boarding pass and discovered that the airline loves A4 but the hotel printer is in a serious relationship with letter, then you have participated in international relations. The extensions of these standards are small negotiations. Fit to page, Scale to 94%. Shrink oversized pages. The margins choose diplomacy. Designers who can recite ISO numbers the way some people recite favorite lines of poetry develop a worldly shrug. Crop marks, bleed, safe area, all the little fences that keep text from falling off the cliff. A letterhead demonstrates its breeding by aligning to a 12mm grid. A form shows compassion by leaving 10mm between a checkbox and its explanation, lest anyone be forced to breathe through typography. Even the humble staple has a sweet spot, 2 centimeters from the corner at a 45-degree angle, because paper, like conversation, appreciates being held without being pinched. A good part of the charm lies in how standards think about error. ISO 216 tells you that a sheet may be 1.5mm too generous or too stingy and still be considered sound. That tolerance is a lullaby for machines, which are comforted by the notion that perfection is approximate. Pulp becomes sheet through water and pressure. The calendar rolls polish it like a modest vanity mirror. Weights tip out in grams per square meter, a phrase people shorten to GSM with the intimacy of a nickname. 80 GSM is the working citizen. Polite opacity, crisp fold, a willingness to accept both ballpoint and fountain pen without melodrama. 100 GSM is a dress shirt on a weekday. 300 GSM is a dignified invitation that will find itself in a drawer for 10 years, keeping company with batteries whose voltage is a question for future people. Reams arrive wrapped in blue paper with diagonal seams that suggest something special is about to be unwrapped, though the surprise is only more of the same. That is precisely the point. Standards also influence the tiny choreography of desks. The A4 tray invites a cascade of trays, in, out, pending, which is office talk for here, gone, and not now. Label makers write in a font that believes in itself. File tabs appear in left, middle, right, because choice is a pleasure even when it changes nothing. The 2-hole punch leaves symmetrical moons that accumulate in the back of the machine until a clerk empties them into the bin with all the ceremony of scattering snow. Someone folds in a 4 into thirds, and the creases align so exactly that you feel trust return to the world in measurable increments. Meeting agendas march down the page with numbered items and generous white space, as though the empty part of the paper were providing emotional support to the busy part. The office plant leans toward the window, the coffee cools to a legally acceptable gloom, and the paper waits, willing to be whatever the day requires. Resume, invoice, apology, poem. There are rival families, of course, who deserve a nod before bedtime. The C-series envelopes partner with as like calm extroverts taking serious introverts to a party. The B-series covers posters, maps, and anything that wants to feel slightly grander without committing to a billboard. There is, surprisingly, a principled logic to all of them, as if a thoughtful aunt had arranged the cutlery drawer with room for odd spoons. Business cards in some countries choose 55 by 85 millimeters, which means they nap inside wallets without jostling the currency. Notebooks exercise personalities, of 5 journals keep secrets compactly. A6 is for shopping lists you do not strictly intend to fulfill. Photographers launch their own rebellion with aspect ratios that do not love the square root of 2, because a dramatic landscape prefers to stretch out inside. Standards merely smile and build new frames. Curiously, the A-series has improved the quality of accidental origami, because the ratio remains obedient. Folding an A4 diagonally to meet a side produces triangles that agree with one another about everything. A child with a dull pencil can conjure a paper plane that glides just long enough to touch the radiator gently, which is all any sensible plane should want. An office worker on hold can produce, after 7 minutes and 30 seconds, a perfectly adequate crane. Even receipts enjoy the hospitality. When a shop prints your purchase on a strip of thermal paper, however long the machine finds interesting, You can still fold it to a 6-ish obedience and insert it into a folder labeled later. Later is famously large. It accepts many sizes. The quiet triumph of the standard is how it guides without nagging. Someone in a town you'll never visit designs a municipal form for registering a dog. Without telephoning anyone, that person makes the boxes exactly the right width for most names and precisely the right height for your patients. A 4 has coached the page to leave a margin where your thumb will naturally settle. On the other side of the planet, a hospital prints discharge instructions for a sprained ankle, and the text lands in familiar coordinates, which makes it easier, somehow, to believe the ankle will heal. In a classroom, students swap worksheets like trading cards. Every mistake they make fits comfortably within the same rectangle, suggesting that failure, too, is standardized and therefore survivable. The paper extends this reassurance to all who approach: engineers drawing ductwork, poets drawing breath, administrators drawing salaries. Even the disputes feel drowsy. A 4 people and letter people argue as if comparing pillows. Each asserts that their rectangle was there first, or higher or deeper or closer to the human spirit. And then they both yawn and agree to print at 100%, scale to fit, or try again with different defaults. Software smooths the borders. Templates translate. You begin to suspect that rectangles are secretly in league with one another to make us think we invented order. What we truly invented was the designation. The rectangles were already there, waiting like chairs in an empty hall. We measured them and felt calmer, in the way that counting sheep requires no sheep to consent. By now the room is quiet enough to hear a ream settle against the weight of itself. A courier somewhere is walking briskly, holding a box under one arm, and the box contains the future in an extremely ordinary format. Someone else is trimming the edge of a poster with a craft knife, and the whisper of the blade through paper is basically the SMR of bureaucracy. In a municipal recycling center, stacks of sheets begin their return trip to slurry, the fibers remembering briefly the water from which they came. A pallet of fresh A4 sits on a loading dock, wrapped in plastic, watching the sky. Inside the building, the night shift prints shipping labels, a 6 polite, adhesive, and the labels stick to cartons with affection. That is the whole plot. It is not a plot, really. It is the world agreeing on a shape, then using it until even the disagreements grow comfortable. So if you're still awake, you might hold an invisible A4 in the air before you, pinching the top corners gently with your fingers. In your mind, fold it in half, then half again. Notice how the edges behave like a well-raised family at a quiet dinner. Imagine writing a single word in the middle. Any word will do, preferably something patient like Thursday. Then fold the sheet once more, let it rest on the table beside the bed, and allow the corners to settle. The day has been cut to size, the margins set, the text aligned flush left with an occasional soft ragged edge to remind you we are human. The rectangle watches over you with the measured kindness of millimeters. Paper sleeps lightly. It is ready, at the smallest touch, to return to work. You do not have to. You might not expect an umbrella to have a travel itinerary, but in the 19th century many of them did, and it was more punctual than their owners. A gentleman can misplace a black silk canopy at noon, and by twilight it would have visited a porter, a ledger, a wooden pigeonhole, and a weighing scale that had opinions about everything. The umbrella would rest among hat boxes and walking sticks like a shy bird in a roost, waiting for a reunion that usually arrived on Tuesdays. If you're still awake by the time we reach the section on tag string thicknesses, feel free to subscribe in the spirit of a luggage label quiet, rectangular, and unlikely to fall off. No pressure. The umbrellas would advise against haste. They learned patience the way fabric learns creases. The Victorian Railway Lost Property Office was a museum that refused to call itself a museum. It collected the ordinary with the zeal of a botanist, and the plants were gloves. Stations began the day with a small ceremony of sweeping platforms, each sweep producing a harvest, a child's shoe, a book half-read, a hat that bore the thumbprint of rushing. Porters practiced the careful scoop, a motion that rescued objects without accusing them. The items traveled to an inner room with a desk that knew secrets. Here sat the ledger, that polite ocean of paper. Each entry marched in columns: date, train, carriage, station, article, material, color, condition, and remarks, where remarks was a space for mild literature. One umbrella, black, well-tempered, a clerk might write, by which he meant the spring still obeyed. One handkerchief, boldly initialed W, possibly William, which is as close as bureaucracy gets to romance. The ink dried in a consistent shade because the pen nibs were replaced every Monday, a schedule drawn up after a brief crisis when Tuesday's writing looked fatigued. The umbrella's first concern was identification, which is the human concern dressed in cloth. Early on, owners stitched their names into the lining with a modest flourish, but fashion and forgetfulness are standing rivals. The railway introduced paper tags with twine that could be tied in a single motion, half-hitch, tuck, and calm pull. The recommended length of string, 18 inches, prevented the tag from flapping like a nervous thought. Tags bore a stamp number, and the number matched the ledger entry, which matched the pigeonhole, which matched the universe. When thousands of objects are inching toward you by train, numbers are the lullaby that keeps you from screaming. Clerks developed a sixth sense for recurring umbrellas. A perfectly ordinary black one might return every other Friday, as if performing a small orbit around an absent-minded solicitor. The clerk would sigh fondly when it came in and remark, "Ah, perihelion." Reunions were a form of theater. A gentleman approached the counter with a face that implied he had never owned an umbrella in his life and was surprised to be asked to prove it. The clerk, who had spent the morning among umbrellas, maintained the gentle authority of a minor constable. Questions proceeded with ritual plainness: length of the shaft, material of the handle, number of panels in the canopy, 8 as a rule, 9 if someone had been overly optimistic. Did the ferrule have an ivory tip or a brass one that pretended to be ivory if you didn't look closely? The claimant answered with the specificity of affection, and the clerk nodded, satisfied. A small fee was due for the privilege of absent-mindedness, and the coin clinked into a box lined with felt so the office would not sound greedy. The umbrella returned to human custody, perhaps embarrassed by the adventure. Railways exported this reunion choreography to parcels, spectacles, and an occasional teapot that had been traveling unchaperoned. Sleep comes easily when you realize how many things have been carefully matched to their owners by people who love calms. Not everything returned to old pockets. The office maintained a calendar of patience. Umbrellas waited for 3 months, stoutly. Gloves stood by for 6 weeks, partly because they never arrived as pairs. Walking sticks lingered even longer, as if they were practicing for retirement. When the days expired, a notice went up with the equanimity of a tide table: unclaimed effects to be auctioned on Saturday fortnight, doors at 10. These auctions were rituals of redemption dressed as shopping. Drapers and clerks gathered to bid on umbrellas that had learned to be philosophical. You could buy a whole weather system's worth of them tied in bundles of 10. A gentleman who arrived hatless might return with 3 and a new sense of purpose. The proceeds funded the office's habit of twine, the decent ink, and the tea that met every afternoon like a well-run committee. Even the leftover items were given futures. Orphaned gloves became polishing clothes. Unclaimed spectacles were measured by the optician who lived next door and sent to the charity hospital with a note explaining their history. In a kind official tone, records reveal so many nearly meaningful facts that one can watch sleep approach like a local train. The average umbrella weighed just under a pound. The heaviest was a gentleman's curiosity with a concealed flask that turned the handle into a polite social risk. The most frequent color was black, not out of a moral preference, but because black dye forgives rain. There were occasional rebellions, emerald canopies that had misread their audience, tartan experiments that proved lovable but loud. In winter, umbrellas arrived with a dusting of snow that distracted everyone until it surrendered to the room's breath. Clerks kept a cloth by the door to lift the water from the fabric in one practiced sweep. It saved ink from moral compromise. The barrels used to store walking sticks were former pickle barrels. You could tell by the faint, righteous smell, and by the way the wood insisted on remembering brine. When a clerk became proficient, he could identify a parasol and a bundle by the soft clink of a card handle against the desk. The parasols were moody about daylight and preferred to spend their waiting time under a shelf. We tend to think bureaucracy crushed mystery, but in lost property, it preserved it like a collector of shells. Among the umbrellas came letters left in pockets, some never posted, addressed to people with names that felt like the beginnings of novels. Clerks were instructed not to read, but a letter has a way of announcing whether it belongs to an apology or an invoice. The stains told stories too, a faint edge of seaside salt, a brown halo of tea, the mineral trace of a city that had not learned to keep its smoke to itself. Tickets slumbered in folded books, third class, second if the day had gone especially well. An umbrella sometimes arrived drunk with the scent of a concert. It kept that perfume through 3 changes of owner like a faint rumor of violin. Micro hooks of history tug at you here, a notice about a lost false beard, a furious telegram demanding the return of a stuffed owl, a child's slate with spelling words rehearsed in a bulletproof hand. You can feel the past nodding off so much motion, and yet everything remains politely still. Railways, being railways, standardize the care of lost things with more tenderness than they standardize the care of people. Offices displayed a printed circular, articles to be arranged alphabetically by type, then by size, then by date. What counted as size for an umbrella was measured not in inches, but in reach, a concept. That included height of owner and ambition of canopy. The office never spoke of reach again, but kept using it because it worked. Staff rotated through a schedule designed to keep them mildly bored and unfailingly kind. The morning clerk recorded, the afternoon clerk returned, the evening clerk sorted and washed the shelves with vinegar water that discouraged dampness and conversation. Every Thursday, the head clerk checked that the twine remained of British manufacture and not the cheaper imported kind that frayed like nerves on a windy day. The room smelled faintly of wood shavings and ordinariness. Even the chairs were standardized, a concession to the art of sitting without noticing that one sits. Umbrella technology kept pace with the timetables. Early sticks were canes with a weather secret, ribs of whalebone, a canopy of silk that behaved like a well-paid servant. Later came steel ribs that snapped open with the clear conscience of industry. Then cheaper cotton ducks that shrugged off rain with proletarian satisfaction. Handles confessed their owners gently. A bishop's crook of holly, a dandy silver skull, a mother's plain loop that fit over the crook of her arm while she counted children in drafty stations. Some canes concealed implements because the Victorian era delighted in being armed for every contingency. There were umbrella-handled rulers and umbrella-handled telescopes, as though one might need to measure or observe during a shower. My favorite was the umbrella with a compartment for coins, perfect for the fare you forgot until the collector appeared with a ticket punch shaped like duty. All these variations went into the ledger with deadpan poise. Umbrella, eccentric, appeared more than once, set down by a clerk who had learned which adjectives could be trusted. Reunions inspired minor philosophy. People reclaiming lost objects often apologized to them, as though the umbrella had spent the interval in a moral wilderness. There you are, one might say, with familial relief. Some owners invented stories on the spot. They had lent the umbrella to a cousin, or to the weather itself. No, it had not been forgotten, merely dispatched on an errand beyond language. The clerk nodded. The office believed in second chances with the cool efficiency of a timetable. Items unclaimed after auctions were adopted by staff who had earned them through weeks of eye contact. There was a porter known to carry a different umbrella every month, as though sampling weathers, and another who kept the same one for years because it clicked open with a sound he considered personally encouraging. Objects, once catalogued, acquired a thin varnish of self, which is not a mystical claim so much as a bureaucratic observation. The number on the tag sharpened them into themselves. It is impossible to make a lost property office sound thrilling, which is exactly why it helps people sleep. Its drama is extremely polite. At most, there is the mild excitement of a parcel that whispers when shaken, or the annual arrival of an unseasonal item, a pair of ice skates. In October, a hot water bottle, and June proof that time can be folded like a railway map. Occasionally, a pet wandered into the narrative. Dogs usually knew better. They fetched their owners rather than being fetched. Once in 1884, a tortoise was found waiting by a pillar as though for the 3:10 to Dover. The ledger entry sums it up. Tortoise. Patient. You are welcome to close your eyes on that line. The tortoise was eventually reclaimed by a woman who did not explain further, which is the correct amount of explanation for a tortoise. By the 20th century, the system had become so practiced that whole cities relied on it the way one relies on a sensible ant. London S. Baker. Street office processed thousands of umbrellas every year and published statistics with the air of a weather report. Tuesdays remained the best reunion day. Sundays were quiet, as if even lost things went to church. The railway printed courteous posters reminding passengers to mind their belongings, and passengers read the posters and nodded while leaving their belongings behind. Telephones shortened the wait and lengthened the conversations. Does the umbrella have a dent 2 inches from the ferrule, left side? A clerk might ask. Yes, the caller would breathe, moved by the intimacy of being known at such a level. Eventually, the motor car began to compete for losses, and the city discovered a new species, the umbrella abandoned on a back seat, which dreams of transfer but wakes to upholstery. We live now in a time that promises to attach our names to everything phone. Watch, earbuds that blink sadly when separated, but the old choreography continues in public offices with strong coat hooks. The ledger has learned to be electronic, which means its ink never runs and its corners cannot curl. Yet the questions remain wonderfully the same: color, length, handle shape, number of panels. And the micro hooks continue as well. The lemon receipt folded into the umbrella sheath. The small repair made with green thread instead of black. The way rain dries into the faintest map of the day's streets. Lost property rooms, far from being dusty afterthoughts, are the quiet engines of faith that the world is not entirely careless. The clerk at the counter performs a civic lullaby. Yes, we kept it safe. Yes, it is here. Yes, you may take it home. Before we let the umbrellas sleep, it is pleasant to consider the ethical notes pinned to them like corsages. Most offices adopted a principle of discretion. They did not comment on the more curious items in the pockets, except to return what could be returned and bend what could not be explained without sincerity. A set of false teeth received a private shelf and a modest tea towel out of respect. A banknote tucked in a lining was sent to the station master's safe. The rule about umbrellas was firm. Once claimed, no scolding. Life is already damp enough. The only exception occurred during truly notorious weather, when the clerk might say, with genial reproach, "A brave day to walk unarmed." Everyone smiled and promised to reform. By now, the office is dim and agreeable. The last commuter has remembered his parcel. The typewriter has stopped giving advice. The clock in the corner insists on the hour with a whisper. The umbrellas stand in their barrels like a small forest trained to be indoors. They are not tragic. They are only waiting. In the morning, some will go home by hand and some by post, packed in brown paper with a string knot that has been perfected through long practice. Others will wait for the auction and begin a second career sheltering new people from familiar rains. The ledger closes with a sound like a satisfied book. A clerk straightens the stack of tags and empties the dish of coins into the felt-lined box, then hangs his own umbrella on a hook near the door. It is the one object he is least likely to misplace, not because he is attentive, but because the office would never let him live it down. The room exhales, the rain patters, and somewhere, trains slide through the night, carrying umbrellas that will, for the most part, arrive where they intend, because most things do, given a number, a string, and a little time. You might not expect that a decision about where to live the rest of your life could be summarized by a pencil mark beside a box, but the Korean War found a way, and the pencil was kept very sharp. It is an oddly quiet piece of 20th century history, the moment when thousands of prisoners of war wearing uniforms that no longer fit and borrowed shoes that did not match stood under light canvas and were asked a small blunt question about home. The air smelled of dust and soap, which is the sort of compromise scent you get when armies tidy up for diplomacy. Papers rustled like dry grass. Clerks practiced neutral expressions the way singers practice vowels. You can sleep through most of it and still understand the gist. Names, dates, signatures, and a waiting bus. If you are still awake when I begin describing the string used to tie the forms into neat bundles, you can subscribe, or you can let that intention drift off like a drowsy balloon. In a story made of boxes to tick, we will move slowly, like a finger hovering over an option. Along the truce line, the first thing anyone noticed was that the forms traveled faster than the men. The armistice was still an agreement in progress, an arrangement being warmed under a diplomatic lamp, but the stationery had already arrived and found a table. It came numbered and ruled and pre-folded because even a pause in a war requires scheduling. Officers in fresh shirts, at least fresh at the collar, began the ceremony of sorting lives into columns. Name, age, nationality, camp, and the tentative heading at the far right, repatriate or not repatriate, printed in a font that looked surprisingly cheerful. The columns were courteous. They gave everyone equal space. A soldier's pass fit into 2 lines if he squeezed his handwriting. His future was a single letter. Returning home, the train tracks behind your eyes would finally lead somewhere familiar. Remaining meant the map would be redrawn while you were standing on it. The clatter of typewriter keys played behind the tents like rain that had taken lessons in punctuality. Every official document carries a promise folded invisibly into it, and this promise was an unsettling one. Men who had switched sides or refused to salute, or simply learned to like the taste of different tea, were being told that the war would let them choose, but only in a very particular way. The choice had to be legible. You could say yes or no, never maybe later, because paper does not accept a maybe. Outside, dust rose and fell like a curtain, and everyone agreed to call the scene neutral. Inside, the forms were stacked in sheaves that the clerks tapped against the table until the edges lined up with the squareness of good manners. The pens were dipped carefully, excess ink patted away, because even a small blot could smear the destiny of a surname. The light shone through the tent wall as a gentle grid, turning faces into brief maps, and someone made a joke about getting sunburned in the pattern of bureaucracy. Only 2 people laughed, which is the correct number for that kind of joke. The neutral tents at Panmunjom were remarkable for being ordinary. The ground had been swept clear of stones. Folding chairs borrowed from an earlier meeting creaked just enough to remind everyone of gravity. Loudspeakers tested the microphones with that particular hum that suggests the sky is thinking. Translators sat with pencils behind their ears, ready to chase meaning across languages like small, determined terriers. When a man stepped inside, a bell marked the hour, a habit learned from train stations, and the rules were read in the same tone used for library orientations. You would be asked plainly. You would answer plainly. Then you would be carried gently toward one set of trucks or another. The center of the tent contained a silence you could feel, a coin balanced on its edge. No speeches about glory or shame were required. There wasn't time, and besides, speeches do not look good on forums. The nearby river kept up its side of the conversation, a soft insistence that geography is patient. The interviews followed a rhythm as soothing and repetitive as breathing. There were 3 questions, although some men remember 2 and some remember 4 because nerves rearrange numbers when asked politely to tell the truth. The questions were simple. Would you return to your country of origin? If not, would you remain here temporarily or request transfer elsewhere? Do you understand that the decision is voluntary and final? The word final always sounded a little shy, like a shopkeeper apologizing for closing early. Each man answered in a voice made hoarse by weeks of practice under his breath. A photographer paused at the flap to capture the ritual of the signature, not for propaganda, he said. Just for the archive, which is propaganda that has learned to whisper. Sometimes the pen stalled and the ink refused to cross a certain letter. A clerk would offer another pen with the solemnity of a priest. In small private seconds, men thought about mothers who baked with sesame oil, about sisters who collected gum wrappers, about streets where the rain remembered their footprints. All that settled into a single line of writing. Outside the wires, other voices continued to talk, because the world enjoys an eavesdrop. Loudspeakers from both sides broadcast advice with musical accompaniment, marshes for one, sentimental ballads for the other. Each broadcast opened with a greeting as if this were an awkward tea party. Announcers promised jobs or warned of punishments. The sentences were tidy, the uncertainties were not. An army chaplain wandered the fence line marking time with a pocket watch he trusted more than he trusted philosophy. A commissar somewhere farther off rehearsed slogans that had crossed oceans to be here, rolling them like marbles in his mouth to keep them from sounding tired. The wind, impartial as ever, shuffled the messages into new arrangements. Everyone learned that the human ear, when tired enough, translates threats into lullabies. You might remember that the microphone smelled faintly of tinned polish, that the speakers developed a dignified cough, that the generator coughed back. The tent hummed gently like a refrigerator deciding not to break. Later, when people tried to explain these decisions, they reached for labels because labels are small and stackable. The favorite label was brainwashing, a word that sounded like a household chore assigned to psychology. Newspapers loved it because it fit neatly into headlines, and it allowed readers to picture a clear sink full of complicated water. In the tents, though, nothing got washed. Belief turned out to be more like bread dough, sticky, elastic, rising and falling with the temperature of the room. Men who kept their faith in the old slogans described it as a warm thing, a hearth to sit beside. Men who left said it had become a jacket that no longer buttoned. Some discovered they were more stubborn than they had suspected. Some discovered the opposite and made jokes about surprising themselves. A few confessed to fear in voices so practical that fear sounded like a colleague you must work with whether or not you like him. The clerks wrote none of that down. In the ledger, belief was represented by a tidy tick mark. Paths forked as softly as the chairs creaked. Those who chose repatriation boarded trucks in files of 5 and went back along routes that maps had traced so many times the paper looked tired. Those who chose otherwise were gathered into different compounds with new fences and were told the fence was there for safety, which fences always are. A man who knew a little English asked for a dictionary to make sure he had picked the right box. The dictionary took 3 days to arrive, during which the box remained both chosen and unchosen, like a philosophy problem nesting inside a tent. Some men wrote letters to families they were not sure would reach them. They addressed the envelopes to the future and hoped the future took delivery. Officers pacing between tents learned to recognize courage by its posture and cowardice by its silence, and were frequently wrong about both. The stories that later returned to villages were careful to applaud the correct heroes. In many places, everyone agreed to remember the pure version because it looks better in school books and because complex memories are expensive to maintain. There is an optical illusion to human life that makes every old decision look inevitable. The archive refuses to indulge it. In cold rooms far from the truce line, the forms were stacked carefully into folders that opened like clamshells. Card files kept index cards muttering about spellings and dates. Files nodded to one another on the shelf like commuters too polite to chat. The writing itself aged into soft brown, which is how paper smiles. A staff member with quiet shoes straightened the bundles of string and wrote labels in block capitals, so even the future would have no trouble reading them. In those drawers lived duplicate entries, missing lines, and notes about men who asked to be asked again, as if the second asking might produce a cleaner sound. When you read these files now, you notice the spacing and the signatures, some bunched tight as fear, some splayed out like the horizon at dusk. The archive is the only place where handwriting can be a weather report. What survives of that summer is precise and oddly gentle. Receipts acknowledge that tea was boiled and cups counted. The inventory of tents describes canvas weight and seam count with the zeal of tailors. A memo advises saving pencil stubs because shipments come slowly in truce time. Someone measured the distance between chairs so that conversations could not become conspiracies by accident. A separate note discusses the ideal shade of paint for a neutral signpost, settling on one whose manufacturer called it cloud. And yet the paperwork can only circle the essential mystery that a person may change allegiance when given a minute to look at a map drawn inside his own ribs. In this way, the forms are honest. They confess their limitations by being so thorough about everything else. The more carefully you total the receipts for twine, the more respectful you must be of indecision. When historians write about the tents, they sometimes marvel at the austere theater of it all. But if you sit inside the records long enough, the drama reduces to habits. A bucket for the floor dust stood near the entrance. It received sand with a sigh and made a fine doorstop when needed. The interpreter's bench had a squeak that could be stifled by placing a folded ration label beneath the back leg. The bell used to mark the hour wore a cloth muffler because the first run of interviews had produced complaints from two notes on the musical scale that clashed with the generator. Details like this do not change history. They only make it inhabitable. We learn that one translator polished his lens with the corner of his sleeve, and that one sergeant tapped his thumbnail against a pen cap while thinking, and that a wind moved the tent flap just often enough to make the future appear and disappear like a small courteous ghost. As the weeks stretched, the decision rooms began to feel like a new sort of village. People recognized each other by shoelaces and coughs. A man who had never cared for dessert developed a devotion to condensed milk toffees because they tasted faintly of civilian afternoons. Another man began collecting stray buttons and kept them in a paper cup, which briefly became a neighborhood currency. A single button could purchase a favor, two could purchase a story. A clerk saved the wrappers from stationery reams, convinced that the wax paper would one day be useful for keeping rain off the ledgers. He was right exactly once, and thereafter kept saving them anyway, because good habits do not insist on usefulness. Even the rules soft at the edges, not by changing, but by being repeated until they sounded like weather forecasts, partly cloudy with a chance of signatures. In the afterlife of the armistice, newspapers printed lists of who had returned and who had not, columns that tried to make statistics carry the weight of feelings. Families read them with lips moving as if the names might answer back. Whole nations exhibited the tidy logic of ideology. Repatriation equals loyalty, non-repatriation equals treachery, or vice versa, depending on the map you used. Yet private diaries recorded homecomings that felt unreliable and departures that felt like relief. One man wrote that home had turned into a hall where every door looked the same. Another that he could not recall the smell of his mother's rice and suspected the memory might never come back. The language of the tents followed them into civilian life. The verb to repatriate became a household word, verbal furniture you could bump into at breakfast. In more than one city, someone painted the word on a wall, and then painted over it, and then painted it again, like a conversation that is not quite finished. Decades later, the paperwork is still tidy. The archive's climate control sighs contentedly. The folders nap with their tabs neatly exposed like polite elbows. When researchers visit, they are given pencils, never pens, and a sheet of clear plastic to protect the pages while tracing the shape of a signature. Reading rooms have a way of improving posture. Even memories sit up straighter under their lamps. If you listen carefully, you can hear the muffled rhythm of rubber stamps traveling down the edges. The ink pads in those rooms are never dry. In a glass box, someone saved the length of the string once used to tie completed forms, knotted in a square knot, well chosen for its honesty. The tag attached to the string describes it as ordinary. You can sleep easily knowing that the empire of paper has a sense of humor that's subtle. Most nights, if you stand near a bookshelf anywhere on Earth and tilt your head just right, you can hear the tense and Panmunjom breathing. The sound is a mixture of canvas and carefulness. Sometimes it seems as though the whole world is a neutral zone, a field between fences where people lay their hands on a page and decide which line to draw through their names. Here's the most boring, and therefore the safest part. The systems worked. Not perfectly, not angelically, but in the practical manner of machines cleaned on Thursdays. Most men who wished to go home went home. Most who wished to remain found a place to wait without being hurried. The tents were taken down and folded. The bell lost its muffler and found a church. The chairs went back to the meeting hall where politics resumed their more flamboyant form of disagreement. Before we end quietly, because quiet helps, there is a bedside question that historians sometimes bring to students, and that students, with admirable patience, do not throw back. If the papers were yours, which box would you touch? The rules of the exercise are simple. Lying awake, you imagine the tents warm with bodies and the future cool as a stream, and you reach toward a box, or you do not. No speeches are allowed. You are encouraged to picture the clerks whose tired care would make your answer easier to read. To picture the string already cut to the exact length required to bundle your decision with others. To picture the pigeonholes that would receive it like cottages receiving letters. If you accept the question, you may place your decision neatly into a corner of your mind and let it remain there, folded and calm. If you refuse it, that refusal is also an entry on a form somewhere, written in patient pencil. The paper does not mind. It has an infinite capacity for sleeping with complicated answers pressed between its lines. So the scene continues, a tent wall sighing as wind rubs against canvas, a pen nib trying its best, a voice translating the question into a language that fits the mouth like bread, a bell that rings softly because someone covered it with cloth, a ledger whose columns line up like sleepers in a long barracks, a clerk who, before he leaves for the night, smooths the top sheet and lays the pencil at the proper angle so morning will arrive feeling expected. Time moves on, trains depart, maps change hairstyles. People learn new verbs, but in that place where paperwork meets human breath, everything goes very slowly, and for once that is a kindness. If you are drowsing now, keep drowsing. The forms will still be there in the morning, thoroughly unexciting, ready to hold whatever you choose to write, or not write in small, careful letters. You might not expect a single check mark to be given a trumpet in the historical archive, but in the Korean War, the smallest marks were escorted through time with all the ceremony of a parade. Somewhere between ceasefire language, and the last shovel of gravel tamped around a tent pole, men were told that their future could be squared to a box. The box had straight edges and agreeable corners. The wind pushed the canvas, which pushed the sunlight, which put faint stripes on the desks like a prison uniform nobody intended. A clerk, the keeper of many quiet destinies, tapped stacks of paper against the table to align them with the sweet, sleep-inducing click you hear in stationery shops. If you remain conscious through the next few minutes, you may subscribe. The subscription, like so many things here, will be voluntary and written in pencil, but I do recommend drowsing. These were tents where the loudest thing was caution. The armistice had the efficient elegance of a set of folding chairs. It opened, it locked into place, and no one leaned back too far. It promised an end to shouting and substituted a schedule. The neutral village established for the task looked temporarily permanent in the way that temporary villages do wooden walkways behaving like streets, lampposts behaving like decisions. Even the mud behaved politely, drying just enough to accept footprints like signatures. The forms arrived first, as forms prefer to do, and they traveled faster than trucks because they were not as heavy with consequence. Each sheet had boxes that implied kindness. The state would make your handwriting easy to process. A question, which had once required speeches and pamphlets, now fit on a single line that ended with a rectangular invitation. There was a right-handed bias to the design. Left-handed men smudged their options and learned the ancient truth that paper has preferences. Inside the tents, officers practiced an important theatrical skill, how to look like furniture. They stood at the edges with expressions stable enough to rest a cup on. Translators rehearsed the script in several languages until the vowels lost their politics. A bell marked the hours with polite authority, softened by a cloth muffler after an engineer determined that the unmuted chime made the canvas vibrate in a way that could be interpreted as agitation. The bell did not wish to be misunderstood. The air smelled of pencils and starch, a combination that suggested neat thoughts. In the waiting lines, boots shuffled a little dance called We Have Time. A man reached the table, and the room adjusted to him the way a pond adjusts to a pebble, accepting the disturbance as part of its job. The question, when it was asked, refused poetry. Will you return to your country of origin? The period at the end did most of the work. Still, the answers contained literature the tent could not record. Uncles who taught card games, sisters who hid coins in the hems of their skirts, mothers whose advice had matured in memory into predictive law. The checkmarks stitched those books closed. I once read in a memo that officials considered adding a fourth option, undecided, but found that the paperwork required to administrate indecision would itself become the sovereign country. So you chose, or said you did. For some men, the word home had grown small during captivity, shrinking like a wool sweater washed in hot rhetoric. For others, home had turned into a horizon they were determined to reach, even if the map was now a rumor. The box did not ask for footnotes. A signature was a sentence. The period was a THUMBPRINT dot. It is one of history's quiet ironies that tents can be more official than buildings. The armistice tents borrowed legitimacy from the ground beneath them, which had survived an impressive number of decisions already. The plywood tables, when tapped, gave off a stout, reassuring sound, and the chairs creaked exactly the way conscience does when asked to sit. A file clerk kept a ruler at hand to keep stacks true. His ruler was nicked along one edge, and if you're still awake, you might like to know that he sanded the nick at night with a matchbox striking surface. He didn't want the ruler to snag on the future. Across the aisle, a young interpreter took notes about untranslatable phrases. He wrote, "The word he uses for home also means gate, or threshold, or season," and then he underlined the note 3 times and never used it. Interviews were conducted with a ritual's patience. 3 questions, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, depending on how the day and the nervous system stretched. The rhythm of it behaved like breathing. Men entered, answered, and left, and the tent exhaled. Cameras blinked occasionally, their shutters performing the only applause permitted. A chaplain sat by the flap, blessing no one in particular but keeping the blessing warmed. A political officer hovered across the road, his briefcase containing paperwork heavy as a suitcase full of promises. The generators out back coughed in a comforting way, like uncles telling the same jokes. If a man became distressed, the clerk gave him a clean sheet and said, "Begin again," with the solemnity of a ritual absolution. It is difficult to imagine a gentler sound than a new sheet pulled free from a stack. Beyond the wire, persuasion was broadcast with an optimism that would make any advertisement executive proud. One side sent marshes, the other sent ballads. Both sent cooking smells on holidays, as if a scent could hop a fence. "Come home," sang one loudspeaker. "Stay free," declared the other, and the wind's only political statement was to blur the verbs. Loudspeakers have a personality when they age, a faint static like a cat purring with an opinion. The men learned to hear what they expected. Some collected the slogans as if they were stamps. Others learned to nap to them, which is perhaps the most powerful rejection available to an idea. A guard once complained that the broadcasts were causing him to dream in bilingual subtitles. An officer put a copy of the complaint into the file where unusual effects were documented, and then carried that file around like a conversation piece. As far as the archive shows, the dreams remained civil. Historians like to reach for big labels because they're easy to shelve. Brainwashing sits in that aisle. It is a word that enjoys its own melodrama. You can almost see the suds. But in the tent, the washing metaphor felt too tidy. The men's decisions were not sparkling. They were muddled like tea leaves at the bottom of a cup. Some clung to ideology like a walking stick in a street with too much ice on it. Some found their convictions had rotated while they weren't looking, and discovered that defection is just a different kind of loyalty, one measured by a new calendar. A few tested pronouns in their mouths, we, they, you people, as carefully as they tested soup with a fingertip. The guards noticed that those who chose to remain often sat with a relieved slump, as if someone had finally recognized their handwriting. Those who chose to return sometimes stood taller in order to demonstrate belief in their own height. Of course, rumor did not require forms. It carried itself lightly through the compounds, inventing reasons for choices. A man who decided not to go home must have fallen in love with the soup, said one rumor. Another rumor considered soup insufficient and decided the man had memorized the wrong flag. An officer wrote a stern memorandum insisting that rumors be discouraged, but the memo was itself so entertaining that it produced a new rumor that entertainment had been formally banned. That is the way with administrative language. It has an amazing ability to become folklore while nobody is watching. Years later, memoirs would insist that everyone knew, at the time, what everyone else really felt. The tense, if asked, would disagree. Canvas has no interest in speaking for others. While the moral drama played in the mind's theater, the logistics made tea. Trains were requisitioned at sensible intervals. Trucks were filled with boxes of tinned goods. Lists were prepared by men who loved lists the way gardeners love hedges. One document survives that specifies how far apart chairs should be for interviews. Not so close that whispering becomes confessional, not so far that an answer needs to be projected like a chorus. Measuring tapes were unfurled with a flourish suggestive of magic tricks. At a certain hour every afternoon, someone tested the bell used to mark the change of shift and wrote in a log always the same sentence. Instrument performs adequately. There are few sweeter lullabies than that phrase. When the men who chose repatriation finally boarded vehicles, The scene resembled a field trip that had misplaced its enthusiasm. Along the route, signposts avoided judgment by being extremely specific. Kilometers to the bridge, hours to the staging yard, number of turns before the road forgets its own name. Those who remained were led to new quarters and handed identification tags that looked unimpressed by philosophy. The tags had holes punched in them, tidy little moons. A small surplus of string, unusable for heavy tasks, was repurposed to tie bundles of forms. A clerk discovered the square knot looked confidently neutral and adopted it as the office knot. It would be adorable to claim that this knot changed anything. It tied things. That was its entire ideology. The newspapers at home performed their editorial arithmetic. Numbers marched across headlines like meat thoughts. So many returned. So many refused. So many misled. So many steadfast, depending on where the paper stood. The public learned to treat check marks as communion wafers, tiny but potent bits of belief. Women reading in kitchens adjusted their understanding of suns by the morning's count. Men reading on streetcars found themselves disliking strangers based on how the strangers folded their papers. Bureaucracy can rearrange sentiment without planning to. It is like a wind that moves curtains and therefore also moves the mood of the room. But out of sight of the headlines, the everyday continued. A shoemaker repaired the heel of a guard's boot. A cook put extra sesame oil in the pot for luck. A child was born inside a hospital where a nurse wrote the date carefully, as if a year could be persuaded to behave. Now we arrive quietly at the storage of it all. The forms traveled to archives with a politeness that would be suspicious anywhere else. Boxes were labeled by hands that had learned patience at the price of interesting handwriting. The climate controls breathed a steady amen. Scholars decades later would request a certain folder and be handed an armful of tangibility. Signatures laid down with the weight of a hand you will never shake. Here and there, someone had pressed too hard and the indentations could be felt on the next sheet, like footprints in thin snow. An archivist left a pencil in the box by accident once. The pencil was retrieved in due time, but the log describing the incident remained a miniature epic about improper graphite. In this place, decisions cast longer shadows than speeches. Reading such papers, you notice small regularities that lobby to be significant. Those who returned often crossed their T's emphatically. Those who remained sometimes filled their O's neatly, as if plugging leaks. One man wrote his name so large it overshot the line and then apologized in a second line, in smaller handwriting, for the enthusiasm. Another added an accent to a letter that had no accent in his language, as if inventing a homeland to match the new choice. The paper did not mind. Its only objection was to moisture. An archivist's rulebook recommends drying wet documents between sheets of blotter and changing the blotter frequently, which is not a bad description of the long 20th century. I am tempted here to tidy everything, to say that men who went back returned to their first grammar and men who stayed began a new tense. But history resists tidy endings in the same way tense resists corners. Returnees found families that had practiced living without them and were now reluctant to give up the skill. Those who remained discovered that ideology has office hours and cannot supervise the evening meal. Some became examples in school books, which made them bigger than they felt while buying cabbages. Others became uncles who spoke carefully about weather. What persisted from Panmunjom quietly, without asking for applause, was the memory of a room where the world spoke to a person and then waited politely for the answer. There is a small habit I admire in the surviving records. After listing an interview and recording the decision, the clerk often added a final notation, explained again. It appears hundreds of times. Each one is a tiny mercy, proof that the choice was described one more time, in case the mind had wandered or the heart had been reading ahead. Explained again. I imagine it spoken at bedtime, a parent retelling the simplest story because the child's eyelids love repetition. It is as if the bureaucracy briefly remembered that people are not paper and therefore may need to loop back to the beginning. One last time before the pen rests. If you've drifted toward sleep, that's all right. These events were designed to be sturdy even when you blink. Somewhere in the stacks, a bundle of beige folders has settled more comfortably on its shelf. The square-knotted string relaxes a fraction, which is not a unit of measurement, but a feeling, and the bell muffler in a display case absorbs a few more hours of silence. A clerk, whose name appears nowhere because clerks rarely headline history, has placed a pencil at a considerate angle so morning will find it ready. The tents are gone, but the patient geometry remains. Lines, boxes, a margin for notes. It is possible, even now, to practice the motion. You lift your hand with care, you let the question sit inside it, and you draw a small mark. Or you don't. The paper accepts both answers and makes room for sleep around them. You might not expect a decision to fit inside a rectangle smaller than a postage stamp, but during the Korean War, a future could be tucked into one neat box and slid across a plywood table. The canvas roof sagged a little with the weight of weather, and the light bulbs hummed in the key of paperwork. Someone straightened a stack of forms and produced the delicate thwack that only a stack of forms can make, the sound a librarian might use to tuck in a book. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. It will be as voluntary as a yawn. The armistice language had already traded gunfire for grammar. Now it needed bodies to stand where the commas pointed and hands to put ink where the lines politely asked. A tent flap clicked against its tie, polite as a doorman. Names arrived before people did typed in crisp letters on rosters that believed. Very earnestly, in the alphabet dot, the choice was not long, and that was the point. Return to your country of origin, remain. The period at the end of each line had the self-confidence of a paperweight. The men who approached the table had different ways of carrying their names. Some wore theirs like a medal, polished and forward. Others kept theirs slantwise, as if ready to hide it from a sudden wind. A clerk, whose job was to be a human ruler, guided each pen toward the correct latitude. He had learned to speak in nouns, date, signature, witness. Verbs could be unpredictable. Outside, gravel performed its gentle percussion under boots, and a truck coughed in a tone that sounded supportive. Somewhere far off, an engine started and stopped and started again. Like an argument practicing to be history dot, the neutral zone dressed itself as permanence, even while it reminded everyone of its temporary permit. Planks pretended to be sidewalks. Chalk lines pretended to be borders. The bell that signaled shifts had a cloth muffler now, making its ringing small and unambitious. Translators rehearsed the opening sentence in 3 languages until it lost all drama and settled into what it had always wanted to be, a polite request. A young officer pinned a map to a post and secured the corners, so precisely that the map looked briefly like a painting of a very tidy country. Men in line computed their pasts and futures with the sort of slow arithmetic you do in a grocery store when you're not sure whether you can afford extra rice. The boxes on the form didn't ask for totals. They wanted only a mark dot. The first thing most men noticed when they sat was the pencil. It had that ordinary hexagon that prevents rolling and encourages forthrightness. Someone had sharpened it thoughtfully, not to a spear, but to a cheerful point. There, under the tent's quiet weather, a person added weight to a line, and the rectangle accepted the burden. The tent flapped once, and then forgot to again. I mentioned, almost idly, that left-handed men smudged their choices more often. The smudge did not invalidate the decision. It simply wrote human in a second language, in a folder labeled with numbers so tidy they looked like etiquette. A clerk placed every smudge with the care usually reserved for jewelry. 3 questions. one signature, and a ritual that had memorized its own movements. The questions walked in single file: name, origin, preference. They kept their shoes clean. Cameras blinked like slow owls, recording for the future the way the future prefers, without commentary and at a frame rate the present barely feels. A chaplain waited near the flap, not to persuade, but to lend the room a small, old kind of stillness. Across the path, a political officer waited too, his briefcase doing most of the talking. The generator exhaled. A pot of tea made the rounds as if it were a colleague who'd been told to socialize. The signature at the end sometimes arrived with gusto and sometimes with reluctance. Both styles looked identical in the archive dot beyond the barbed wire. Persuasion took up its post on wooden poles and spoke through loudspeakers. Music traveled the wind like leaflets that had learned to sing. Marsh came first, then ballads. Then the friendly voice of someone's uncle explaining that home had saved a seat and was keeping it warm. From the other side, an answering uncle updated the menu. Freedom came with soup. The wind, being an excellent editor, mixed the tracks until they produced a neutral hum. Guards learned to nap to it. Some men collected phrases as souvenirs. One wrote down a sentence he liked: "The new life will respect your skills," and later used it as a label on a box of spoons. It turns out that spoons enjoy respect too. The interviews never tried to be dramatic. They preferred the unflashy glide of procedure. One officer counted the seconds between question and answer with the same tenderness. He used to count his daughter's breaths when she slept. He wrote the numbers in the margin and discovered nothing, which is often the cleanest discovery. When a man hesitated, the clerk offered a fresh sheet and said, "Begin again," and the sheet gave off a louder whisper than paper usually does. The ink bottle wore a cloth collar in case of accidents. If you're still following along with eyes open, feel welcome to do whatever a comfortably tired person does next. Adjust the pillow. Imagine the smell of starch. Let your attention sit down for a moment and take its boots off. Labels arrived later, carried by newspapers and committees the way labels generally travel on schedules with footnotes. Brainwashing enjoyed a moment of celebrity. It has a melodious rhythm, that word, like a persuasive detergent commercial. But what happened in those tents was older and smaller. Some men gathered up the past like a coat they'd left on a chair and put it back on. Others decided the coat no longer fit their elbows. One man said the word "we" and looked briefly surprised, as though he'd expected it to taste different. Several tried on the phrase "you people," the way you try a hat tilted the other way. Not necessarily better, but interesting. A few found that staying felt less like a choice and more like admitting what had already happened to their thoughts. While they weren't watching them closely, paths forked as politely as paths can. Those who chose repatriation climbed into trucks that sounded optimistic until the second gear. Guards checked straps and made practical remarks about weather. Those who remained collected new identification tags with holes punched in dignified little moons. Someone tied strings with square knots and called it standard operating procedure. On the road, a sign informed everyone of the distance to a bridge that no one was thinking about. Signs are democratic like that. In kitchens, cooks added a little more sesame oil and called it luck. At the same moment, on the other side of the world, a clerk in a newspaper office tightened a headline into numbers. Numbers travel well. They always pack light. Years later, the stories returned for their review. Memoirs rewound the tape with the confidence of a narrator who has met the ending and knows which scenes were foreshadowing. Families domesticated the past into parables suitable for dinner. A cousin said. He stood up to the officer, and the room nodded, though no one could recall an officer who had needed standing up to. A neighbor said he was misled, and the room nodded again, as rooms do when the conversation must end before the kettle boils dry. The tents had no objection. They had been folded, their ropes coiled like thoughts that would not startle anyone if found in a drawer. A museum later placed a tent stake in a case and gave it a label longer than the stake. The stake did not complain. Meanwhile, in the true capital of every bureaucracy, the archive, the papers found a climate that could be trusted not to have opinions. Boxes were labeled in a handwriting that held itself like good posture. On certain afternoons, the air in the stacks sat so quietly that you could hear the certainty settling out of things like dust. A researcher requested a carton and received a calm, rectangular answer. Inside, signatures had the texture of intentions finished long ago. Where someone had pressed too hard, the sheet underneath bore a relief map of decision. An archivist once left a pencil in a box by mistake and recorded the incident with theatrical remorse. The memo occupies 3 pages and cites 4 procedures. The pencil is an uncredited co-author. When scholars handle these files, they often imagine the tents while sitting in a room made of concrete and fluorescent afternoons. They notice habits that insist on becoming patterns. Those who return like to cross their T's with enthusiasm. Those who remained often produced a cautious dot, a dot that looked as if it had checked the terms and conditions. There are exceptions, of course, in numbers large enough to make the pattern a friendly superstition rather than a law. One folder contains a man's signature in 3 sizes large, medium, modest, on 3 forms stamped duplicate, triplicate, quadruplicate. You can almost see him shrinking to fit the bureaucracy. The paper, democratic as ever, accepts all 3 and files them alphabetically under A for alive that day. There is another small, repeating phrase in the margins that deserves a little pillow to rest on, explained again. After the interview, after the choice, after the witness signed, a clerk would write those 2 words. They function as a lullaby for the legal mind. Explained again. The process repeated because repetition is the only trustworthy machine humans ever built without oil. If you have found yourself listening with half an ear while the other half wanders off to a quieter field, this is a comforting place to do it. Explained again. In the stacks of an air-conditioned building that imagines itself a seasonless country, the notation is the sound of someone checking that a door is really gently shut. Archival rooms have a smell that refuses adjectives. It is part cardboard, part ink, part the barely audible breath of past tense. The climate system hums like a cello practicing scales. When the boxes are opened, they afterward rest slightly agape, as if they intend to say something else but think better of it. An intern once attempted to catalog the different shades of manila. After 19 entries, the list gave up and wrote Manila Confident. A historian copied numbers into a notebook using precisely the pressure of someone not wanting to dent the page. The notebook later would travel to a conference hotel where an audience would drift gently while learning that 3.1% of signatures included a middle initial. If you are drifting, you are participating accurately in the life of Data, the last scene, if we can call it that without implying any climax, belongs to the bedside. Imagine a simple room with a clock convinced it is being helpful. Imagine the question asked without chairs or forms. If offered again, which box would you touch? Not because anyone will ever ask you, but because wondering is a household chore the mind performs to keep the floors clear. If you would return, what does the word return mean when the country has moved 2 centimeters while you were deciding? If you would remain, what is the difference between remain and arrive when you are already there? This is philosophy at the knitstand level, easily moved when dusting. The original tents have been folded. The loudspeakers retired to warehouses where objects practice forgetting the sentences they once said. Only the rectangle remains, a shape the human hand knows by instinct, like the curve of a bowl or the habit of a door. A man once told his daughter, years after choosing not to repatriate, that he had selected the box because it stood on the side closer to the window. It was a joke with a gentle hinge, and the daughter laughed the way people laugh when they are relieved not to be asked for more detail. Another man, who did go back, said he had thought of his mother's rice jar and could not imagine a future where the jar existed without him. His son, hearing this as an adult, imagined the jar as an object of heroic architecture. In reality, it was small and dented, and the dent matched exactly the curve of his father's decision. Archives do not keep rice jars, but they nod respectfully toward the places where such jars would sit. Newspapers from the era host solemn numerators and denominators who still believe they did something useful. We let them keep their belief. In a file marked missed notes, a clerk penciled a reminder to order more blotter paper because the rainy season was making documents feel sentimental. The reminder shares a folder with a seating plan that ensures no chair directly faces the door, lest a man feel hurried by the future. You cannot prove that such arrangements changed minds, though you can reasonably claim they softened voices. Kindness in a bureaucracy is often a matter of furniture. Somewhere, a chair kept two arguments from standing up. If you sit with these papers long enough, your eyes learn the rhythm of their quiet architecture: margin, line, box, line, period. The period is the smallest whole thing we have. The mark at the end of an answer closes nothing, and also closes enough for the next sheet to begin. A historian can make a career out of explaining the difference again. A clerk can make a life out of pressing the pages flat with a hand that no one will remember. Somewhere in the stacks, a box breathes a small sigh whenever the room's door opens. A weather change that counts as drama in a place that distrusts plot. The pencil is placed at a considerate angle so morning will find it ready. You might let your thoughts do likewise, and if you wonder what the men felt when they stepped away from the table, if an invisible audience applauded, if a breeze offered a verdict, there is only one reliable answer. They heard the same sound you're hearing now. Canvas settling, paper relaxing into the shape of a decision, footsteps moving toward whatever comes after a rectangle. The world beyond the tent was exactly as curious as it had been an hour earlier. The loudspeakers tried a final verse, and then, as evening arrived, remembered how to be poles. The bell with its muffler considered ringing, and then chose not to. Somewhere, a pot of tea waited for permission to go cold. None was needed. The night performed its administrative duties with grace, filing everything under the comforting alphabet of sleep. You might not expect an umbrella to change the course of paperwork, but in Victorian Britain, a wet hat had a way of making history readable. Tonight we will stroll, very slowly, through the administrative life of lost and found ledgers in 19th century railway stations, where the only chase scene is a clerk chasing a rolling inkwell. The topic is pleasantly specific, like a postage stamp on a dinner plate. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. You'll be officially noted in the register under Persons Taking an Interest, a column that, tragically, no real ledger ever had. The railway age promised speed to passengers and slowness to documents. Luggage galloped. Lists dawdled. Somewhere between rush and hush, a pair of spectacles, mislaid on a bench during 1863, began a long and bureaucratically satisfying relationship with a book bound in leather that smelled convincingly of responsibility. The first detail to me is a desk. The desk occupies the corner of a station office that isn't on any tourist map because maps rarely include quiet. Its top has been trained to offer patience, and it carries a blotter whose felt has acquired the brownish dignity of a well-steeped tea bag. The clerk lets give him a simple, sturdy name like Mr. Harris arrives before the trains do, because trains never arrive at the same time as trains in the records. He unlocks a drawer that contains a string, a ruler, 2 pencils, and a folded circular from head office entitled, with a stern flourish on the proper reception of articles found. The circular reminds the reader that umbrellas are to be opened briefly for inspection, lest they conceal illicit correspondence, a possibility that never once materializes, which is exactly why it is lovingly preserved in paragraph 4. As the office warms, iron wheels begin to pronounce their syllables outside, and the station's day approaches in a sequence of polite coughs. Mr. Harris's ledger measures 15 inches by 10.5, a size ideal for both fax and naps. The paper is foolscap because someone decided that a fool's hat was an appropriate unit for recording useful information. At the top of each page, a heading stretches its limbs: date, hour, nature of article, where found, by whom, numbered label applied, and disposition. Each heading is a little promise, and the promise is to be utterly unsurprising. A porter enters with a bundle wrapped in dignity. Left-hand glove kid leather, the porter reports, and Mr. Harris writes it down with the calm of a man who could label a sunset without blinking. He affixes a tag to the glove with a cotton string that has existed to become cotton string. The tag bears a number, and the number bears a future. Every lost item becomes a story that has agreed to be quiet. The office runs on small rituals that feel like habits even on the first attempt. For instance, everything found between platforms must be aired near a window to discourage odors. Nets of dissuasion hang invisibly beside the window, and the odors, properly warned, rarely trespass. A second ritual involves hats. Hats are stored upside down to prevent mischief of edge. The instruction comes from an unknown person in the traffic department, who perhaps once met a mischievous edge and never recovered. Mr. Harris honors the tradition with a professional solemnity. A hat arrives that has made the acquaintance of rain. He sets it on a windowsill, crown down, allows the window to think about opening, and records. Hat felt softened by weather. Gentlemen's, found near bookstall. The bookstall, like most bookstalls, is always pleased to be mentioned. Occasionally, a discovery arrives with opinions. A basket containing oranges appears, and the oranges have no patience for paper. Mr. Harris documents them under perishables, to be offered to local authorities or appropriate charities. After 12 hours, he inspects one for signs of literary ambition and, finding none, returns it to the community of oranges. A bottle of cologne surfaces, and the office smells briefly like a wealthy aunt. He writes with grave restraint, scent French, fair quantity. A micro hook for the willing listener. In 1871 at Paddington Station, a parcel labeled urgent butterscotch was logged with 3 underlines, a level of emphasis usually reserved for the weather. All this is history's equivalent of counting sheep. If the sheep carried umbrellas and receipts by late morning, forms have multiplied the way forms do. One tallies, another acknowledges, a third accompanies the object on its journey to the general repository. The general repository is a place that sounds almost fictional, like the idea of a museum trying to appear in a dream. It is, in truth, a long room in a larger station with a ceiling that knows the lives of cobwebs intimately. Here, lost objects go to practice waiting. They line shelves labeled with numbers whose only excitement is their ability to go on forever. An umbrella with a varnished handle rests beside a parcel of crochet hooks. They do not converse, but if they did, they would agree on the value of patience. Everything is sorted by a system pleasing to the tidy imagination. Long things to the right, fragile things to the left, and baskets, wherever baskets are happiest at lunchtime. The clerks read the ledger as one might read a novella, with snacks. Entries are admired for penmanship, because penmanship is the nearest thing to applause in an office where nothing ends. The chief clerk approval nods a particular elegant ampersand and murmurs, "Yes, very good ampersand," as if the symbol had made a moving point. If you are still listening with eyes open, consider subscribing, but with the same degree of effort as lifting a saucer. Some ledgers drew tiny hand-pointing symbols, manicules in the margins to call attention to vagrant curiosities. One left boot only, the little hand announces, engaged in a mystery it refuses to pursue. A more excitable office might have launched investigations. The ledger simply turned the next page and sharpened its pencil. Afternoons bring the public, which is a category best handled slowly. The claimant's desk occupies the opposite corner and behaves like a judge who enjoys tea. Visitors approach with faces rehearsed somewhere between hope and embarrassment. A woman inquires about a shawl that was both gray and also somewhat not, and Mr. Harris, who is fluent in modest contradictions, searches the descriptions for gray. Possibly not. He produces 3 shawls, each a well-meaning cousin of the original. She chooses the wrong one with confidence. He gently suggests the right one by pointing to a small mended patch that he could not possibly have known about, and yet seems to have always known. A gentleman requests a cane with a silver top and is surprised to learn there were 7. He tries each for height, giving the office its daily ballet. The clerks maintain a tool they call the particulars buck, which exists because the world loves generalities but returns for particulars like a dessert spoon for a second pudding. Here the descriptions are embroidered into usable distinctions: umbrella, whalebone, 12 ribs, faint initials NG, spectacles, tortoiseshell, 1 screw sulking, trunk brown, narrow, containing shirts and miscellaneous seriousness. The phrase catches on, and soon seriousness is the most common item in any trunk. In one entry, a clerk writes, "Loot, wooden, improbable, found on platform 5," and draws a tiny question mark that looks pleased to be invited. The loot is later claimed by a gentleman who calls it ornamental, which, historically speaking, may be the loot's most practical profession. Now and then, the ledger records a confession. "I left my parcel deliberately," writes someone who wishes their parcel to travel farther than the person who brought it, to see where it would go. The parcel goes to the general repository, as all things do, and thus the experiment reaches its end in a room that looks exactly like beginning. On other days, a claimant produces a description so tender that the clerks feel, briefly, like souvenirs themselves. It is a child's toy horse, wooden, with 1 ear mended. When you pick it up, it makes the sound of a small apology. They find it because the apology sound is distinctive. Apologies carry well in rooms built for waiting trains. Evening brings audits, a word that sounds like a type of weather. The ledgers gather into small stacks. Spines align the way soldiers align shoulders in paintings. A supervisor compares the numbered labels applied with the entries removed, and finds with mild surprise that the arithmetic continues to behave. In 3 neat columns, found, claimed, unclaimed, the day arranges itself into the simplest possible story, which is some returned. The remainder receive a future date, a small inheritance of time. After 3 months, unclaimed yields to the charity sale. An event described with button enthusiasm proceeds to benefit the Widows and Orphans Fund. Cakes provided. Imagine the auctioneer lifting a hat and saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, lot 42, a hope carefully used," and the room nodding because they have all worn one. The second scene, if we may call it that without quickening the pulse, is a visit to the repository itself, where history rehearses tidiness. The floorboards know where to creak and where to politely refrain. An attendant, Mrs. Beckett, wears a ring of keys that jingle with the authority of lullabies. She maintains a card index with the devotion of a gardener, trimming misfiled leaves and encouraging the blooming of cross-reference. When a request arrives from a distant station, do you hold item matching description, bundle of letters tied in ribbon? Melancholy? She consults the drawer labeled L and produces a card that replies, in its paper way, yes, with ribbon faded to sincerity. The letters, as often happens, are retrieved unclaimed. People mislay not only objects, but also the reasons to reclaim them. Shelves present their geography with the clarity of a moral tale. All umbrellas live together and have learned not to invade other provinces. Gloves live near gloves and, like neighbors, have developed the ability to ignore differences in size. Walking sticks prefer the higher shelves, perhaps out of ambition. Trunks squat near the ground, confident in their gravity and disinclined to conversation. Every so often a stranger arrives, a copper kettle, for example, or a top hat so tall it almost requires planning permission. Mrs. Beckett writes a card for each. She measures the hat and notes its mood, dignified, not proud. She taps the kettle to see if it has an echo of boiling stored in it. It does faintly, which she notes under acoustics. Researchers of a certain temperament visit the Bodhicitta repository to study the sociology of absent-mindedness. They speak in careful sentences about industrialized forgetting, a phrase that might be a criticism or a bedtime story. One professor counts how many of the umbrellas are black versus colored and concludes, bravely, that black umbrellas are easier to forget because they have already forgotten themselves. Another study is misdelivered parcels and announces that the most frequently misdirected label is to aunt, as if aunts were widely distributed postal districts. Mrs. Beckett listens with the indulgent smile of someone who knows that data, like umbrellas, is happiest when opened gently. Occasionally, an item becomes famous. At Euston in 1882, a whole cello was found in a third-class waiting room, leaning against the wall as if thinking about standards. The ledger logged it without adjectives. The newspapers added all the adjectives they could find. A month later, a man reclaimed it and played a small concert to prove ownership, testing the acoustics of the repository so thoroughly that it became momentarily a music hall that had forgotten to charge admission. The ledger wrote, "Cello returned." Its spare style sometimes reads like poetry that refuses rhyme. If you are still awake, feel free to consider the way returned and retained differ by only one letter. As if fate had a minimalist budget dot between claims, the repository absorbs the slow excitement of maintenance. Labels are re-inked. Strings are retied. The air is persuaded to remain the same temperature by a window that opens to precisely the angle recommended by head office. Dusting occurs with a feather duster that has studied diplomacy. It removes without offending. A clock on the wall has practiced honesty and keeps time even when no one thinks it. When I say nothing happens here, I mean the particular, valuable kind of nothing that lets a person's pulse lower into the mattress of habit. Somewhere a porter yawns, and the yawn travels down the aisle, perching briefly on a row of tea trays before continuing into a box of children's marbles, which do not notice. Our third scene returns to claimants, those temporary protagonists who try not to disturb the furniture. The Railway Clearinghouse has issued guidance. One must prove ownership without resorting to dramatic gestures. Proof may include a description of a scratch shaped like a letter, a duckling doodle inside the lid, or the memory of a letter enclosed in an envelope enclosed in a pocket. A man arrives convinced that every umbrella in the repository is his by right of temperament. He is guided to the particulars book, which, being composed of details, cures him. A young woman retrieves a notebook with its edges bitten by thought. She demonstrates ownership by finishing a half-written sentence in the same cramped optimism as the first half. The sentence turns out to be about plum jam. No one is surprised. Children bring an energy that the ledgers absorb like blotters. One boy claims a toy soldier, mislaid during a campaign to visit an aunt. He lines up 4 recovered soldiers on the counter. introduces them to one another, and leaves the fifth, found by someone else that morning, where it is. Because armies must be distributed fairly, Mr. Harris writes, toy soldier stayed. Prefers company. Another child arrives for a skipping rope and, on retrieving it, feels compelled by nature to skip down the corridor, demonstrating that property law can also be exercised. The ledger notes, rope returned, put immediately to purpose. Some entries simply want to be verbs, and the clerks indulge them. On quieter afternoons, claimants are stories without plots. A gentleman brings a claim for a melancholy parcel. He means a black parcel tied carefully, and the repository produces 3 of these in different shades of sorrow. He chooses the one with a knot he recognizes, that precise confidence in loops that only the previous tier can notice. Inside is a pair of boots and a letter he is not ready to read in public. He thinks no one and thinks everyone. The entry reads, parcel black, reclaimed by person who knew the knot. A woman arrives with a small terrarium, a traveling fern. She apologizes to the fern for the delay, waters it with the last of her tea, and carries it home like a quiet treasure. If ever history asked for a mascot, the fern would volunteer and then excuse itself for being intrusive. Now, to complete our unhurried tour, the 4th scene shifts to the afterlife of the unclaimed. There is a sale, yes, but the sale in the series is not a spectacle. It is a tidy redistribution of patience. The auction catalog is written by a poet who believes in numerals. Lot 19, umbrella, stout. Lot 20, umbrella, more stout. Lot 21, umbrella, stoutest. The day smells of buns and pennies. Bidders include thrifty clerks, hopeful spouses, and a gentleman who collects inkwells as conversation pieces and has found them superior to actual conversations. The auctioneer's hammer makes the non-committal cluck of an amused chicken. Proceeds are counted and travel with ceremony to the appropriate fund, where they rest with other good intentions. Some objects evade sale by condition or by personality. The repository keeps a museum shelf of notable curios, a private exhibition to which no one sells tickets. Here the cello once stood until reclaimed. Here also a box of unaddressed valentines, purchased in bulk and bravely unmailed. A pair of ice skates from a station that rarely met winter. A collection of left gloves that have formed a society as left gloves will. The label for the gloves bears a note. Right gloves compiled separately. Détente ongoing. The shelf is a quiet reminder that the world contains objects whose stories prefer to remain a little unresolved, and that we can be fond of them without forcing an ending. Back in the ledgers, the year completes itself at its own pace. The first page has acquired a small curl. The last page waits with modest eagerness. A new volume is ordered, slightly stiffer, as all new volumes are when they have not yet met T. Mr. Harris retires one spring and bequeaths to his successor a blotter, a good ruler, and the knowledge that umbrellas with carved birds on the handle usually find their owners faster than umbrellas with nothing to say. He writes a final entry, clerk, Mr. H, departed to other duties. Pen nibs accounted for, and leaves the office to the steady governance of habit. Mrs. Beckett, years later, will label a box, OPs, not entirely powerless, and place it beside the catalog of particulars as though the two share a private joke. They do dot by the end of the century. Procedures become more regular than clocks. Every station submits monthly figures, and the general repository compiles them into charts that are thrilling mainly to chairs. 1 month shows a spike in umbrellas because rain impersonated drama. Another shows an outbreak of lost books. A traveling library had mistaken platforms for shelves. The report uses adjectives one might reserve for porridge. Notable, satisfactory, within expectation. Somewhere a manager drafts a memo about standardizing the string length for tags too long, and it dangles untidily. Too short and it refuses to tie, and after several meetings, the proper number of inches is decided. The decision pleases the string, which is happy to have a sense of destiny. And then there is S, leaning over these pages with modern eyes that try courteously not to modernize. We find, among thousands of entries, a little treasury of humanity that never raises its voice. The ledgers do not scold. They do not mourn. They do not interpret. They constitute the tenderest possible genre, reassurance by enumeration. They say, in effect, that not everything misplaced is lost, and not everything unclaimed is unloved. Some things are simply resting under an agreed heading. We could, if we wished, make grand claims about the emergence of urban anonymity, or the choreography of industrial movement, or the sociology of pockets. But the ledger does its best work as a bedtime companion, page after page of items that have stopped moving and consented to be remembered in small handwriting. If you are almost asleep, you are behaving much like a trunk marked miscellaneous, the category into which the brain puts everything for now, promising to sort it tomorrow. Picture one last entry: spectacles, wire, slightly anxious. Found on bench. Reclaimed when claimant put them on and the world sighed into focus. The clerk underlines nothing. The page number is noted without fanfare. Outside the office, a train departs with the sound of a deep, agreeable breath. Inside, the ledger closes itself with a dignified thump that refuses to disturb anyone. The umbrella by the window has finished being an exhibit and returns to being a shadow. The sink performs a final, very modest trip, and the night, doing what nights do better than any archive, files everything under the only index we truly consult: sleep. You might not expect a signature to weigh as much as a suitcase, yet on a warm afternoon at the end of the Korean War, a single name written in a neat rectangle could tip a life toward one country or another, like a teacup deciding between saucer and table. The armistice created a peculiar quiet that sounded less like peace and more like a pause button someone had pressed with a glove. Trains still clattered in distant depots, but here, in places with names that do not need to be dramatic camp. X reception center, transit compound, the noise was mostly paper. Lists were drawn and redrawn until the ink looked tired of deciding. A clerk held a wooden ruler the way a conductor holds a baton, except the orchestra was columns. If you're still awake when we get to the tents at Panmunjom, you may subscribe, or you may fold gently into the upholstery of sleep. Either choice will be recorded in a ledger that is very understanding. The first thing the armistice did was introduce a new genre of conversation, the kind that fits in boxes on forms. Name, number, captured where, wishes to go where. The person speaking might have a coat 2 sizes too big and a voice several sizes too small, but the boxes were always the same size. Even the pencils, stubby from busy days, seemed to have practiced neutrality. Along the truce line, poles raised wire like unslept thoughts. Loudspeakers spoke syllables into the hills, and the hills rephrased them softly so birds could understand. In some camps, the day began with porridge and ended with inventories, a rhythm that made the calendar behave. Translators traded sentences the way children trade marbles, earnestly, occasionally losing track of whose was whose. People stood for hours and time, a resource that rarely runs out but often spills trickled under boots. The lists contained misprints that felt peculiarly affectionate, an S upgraded to a G, a village spelled in a way that suggested the cartographer had been distracted by a sandwich. There were men who would be asked the same question 3 times, just to see if the answer slipped in a different drawer each attempt. Return to home, the form asked, as though home were a railway station with a polite schedule. But home had its own paperwork, written in weather and memory, A lane, a habit, a mother's soup recipe that refuses to convert into measurements. For some, not going home was less a rebellion and more a continuation of being lost. For others, it was a logic that felt to them as tidy as a fresh haircut. The neutral zone at Panmunjom was arranged with the calm fussiness of a wedding. Rehearsal. Tents faced each other like guests who are not sure whether to wave. Inside, tables were positioned so precisely that even the tape measure seemed to salute. Chairs were wooden, which meant they observed everything and said nothing. Tea kettles warmed, but not enough to be interesting. On the ground, chalk arrows encouraged feet to make decisions without incident, as if indecision were a kind of mud that could be tracked across the armistice. Into this carefully arranged hush came fleets of buses, their engines whispering the world's most ordinary melody, idle, idle, idle. Men stepped down carrying nothing heavier than their names. Some wore uniforms faded into the same general color as the roads. A bell rang sometimes to mark the hour, and the bell tone climbed into the bare sky like a note auditioning for a choir. The paperwork promised a choice that sounded simple when printed but behaved like weather when lived. There were really 3 boxes: return, remain, or go to a third country, though the third box often stood there like a polite guest at a party who doesn't know any of the other shoes. The rules demanded that the question be asked out loud, distinctly, and recorded by a person who did not blink too much. The questioners were trained in phrasing that felt smooth even on rough days. They rehearsed it the way one practices tying a tie. Across the tables, answers came in the grammar of lives: a pause, a yes, a no, a condition, a gesture at the ground, a story about a village that was now a rumor. The tents held all the vocabulary they could, but some words preferred to remain in the chest. Outside, flags lifted in the light wind and displayed their patient ideas. Rituals of interview sprouted with the reliability of dandelions. A man would sit, a pencil would be sharpened, a translator would lean in as though catching a tune on a radio 2 rooms away. State your wish, the form required, and the man would, sometimes with the practical tone of someone ordering boots, and sometimes in a drifting paragraph that refused to end where the box did. Once or twice a questioner mislaid his pencil mid-sentence, and the entire table paused to look for it with the piety reserved for lost relics. When found, the pencil was documented as though it too had a nationality. Another custom grew unintentionally: the clearing of throats just before a signature, a little chorus of tiny drums. Signatures themselves behaved like relatives, some extrovert, some modest, a few that burst into florid loops as if to prove existence by flourish. The signature sealed nothing mystical. It simply permitted the next page to begin. Beyond the wire, voices practiced persuasion the way rain practices roofs. Loudspeakers offered careful messages in multiple languages, none of them loud enough to disturb birds in the reeds. Leaflets drifted down like abundantly helpful leaves. One promised shoes that actually fit. Another suggested that a person might like the idea of a particular river more than another. You could imagine a leaflet purchasing a train ticket. It had that energy. Guards collected the paper climate as though tiding autumn. Soldiers tucked some into pockets to help line memories. Not every sentence traveled to the right address, of course. Words often wander, and some camp dogs were seen sleeping on paragraphs about dignity. Occasionally, a chaplain would arrive with a box of hymns, an interpreter, and a willingness to listen to people who had not been invited to be heard for a while. On those afternoons, the camp sounded like a library thinking about lunch stop between conversations. Men refined the important craft of waiting. Waiting became a profession with no retirement age. It involved warming hands on cups, measuring time by the length of shadows on a fence, and playing chess with bottle tops trained to impersonate bishops. Newspapers reached the compounds with headlines that looked like their own furniture. Rumors circulated in well-behaved circles. One said the trains would be red, another that all trains were secretly agreements disguised as locomotives. The cooks tested new theories about noodles. A barber sat up on a stool and adopted scissors to diplomacy. Now and again, a man who had said yes to returning changed his mind and tried the word no on for size or the other way round. The forms permitted such tailoring with the same grim generosity as a well-run dry cleaner. No one was officially hurried. The tents at Panmunjom promised time as a service. When the phrase brainwashing floated into newspapers, it found instant welcome the way a dramatic guest brightens a polite dinner. It is a word that sounds like it should leave a towel on the radiator. Reporters loved it because it looks strong in headlines and employs a metaphor with indoor plumbing. But the camps contain something more ordinary and more stubborn: belief, fear, calculation, exhaustion, and the quietly compelling pull of whichever future seemed less like a cliff. Instruction sessions, lectures, and songs certainly existed. So did obstinacy, humor, and men who were simply allergic to being told. Some chose not to return because they had left a home long before this war, and the new address written inside their ribs did not match the old map. Some did return because their grandparents' fields raised stronger arguments than any pamphlet. Between these poles stood thousands who did their sums with a stub pencil until the figures felt like company. Labels helped people feel tidy even when nothing else cooperated. Public statements needed categories in order to breathe. The press obliged with names that promised certainty. Propaganda victims, one line read, as if a diagnosis could keep you warm at night. Die-hard loyalists, said another, which sounded pleasantly wooden. Inside the tents, the men being placed in such containers remained less decorative. A quiet fellow signed for a third country because he liked the idea of starting again with a dictionary at an unclaimed afternoon. Another stayed where he had been detained because he had learned the routine and preferred the known boredom to the unknown bustle. A few stood halfway to the bus and discovered halfway was a place with its own gravity.